Let's talk about the first philosophy idea, will to live. The will to live is a core philosophical concept, most famously advanced by the German philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer. It is not simply the biological instinct for self-preservation, but a dark, powerful, and ceaseless metaphysical force that drives all existence. Imagine looking out at the world, not just at human beings, but at all life. You see a cat relentlessly stalking a mouse. You see a tree rooting concrete to find water. You see a crowd fighting desperately for a finite resource. In all these actions, there is a blind, striving, and fundamentally irrational energy. This energy, this inexorable, unceasing drive for existence and perpetuation, is what Schopenhauer calls the will to live. The will as a blind force. Schopenhauer's unique contribution was to characterize this will not as a rational or benevolent force, but as a blind, aimless, and insatiable energy. It is not governed by reason. Reason is merely a tool the will uses to achieve its ends. It is not concerned with happiness. It is concerned only with more life. It is an endless cycle of want and satisfaction, where satisfaction is always temporary, leading immediately back to a new state of wanting. The ultimate goal of the will to live is not the survival of the individual, but the perpetuation of the species. This is why the drive of sexual desire, the impulse to create new life, is the will's most potent manifestation, outweighing the rational self-interest of the individual. The source of suffering. For Schopenhauer, the will to live is the singular source of all human suffering. Life is perpetual want. To be driven by the will is to live in a state of continuous striving, a cycle where every desire fulfilled simply gives rise to 10 new desires. True, lasting happiness is a logical impossibility, because the moment the will is satisfied, it creates a new lack. The unconscious master. The will uses the intellect and the individual ego merely as its servants. We believe we are making rational choices, but we are simply acting out the impersonal, dark agenda of the will to perpetuate itself. The path to deliverance. If the will is the root of all suffering, the only path to peace is the denial of the will to live. Schopenhauer suggested that this denial could be achieved in 3 stages. Aesthetic contemplation. Temporary escape through appreciating art, music, or beauty, where the intellect pauses its service to the will. Moral compassion. Recognizing the will as the source of suffering in all beings, leading to an ascetic life of universal compassion. Asceticism. The complete and final quieting of all desires, including the will to perpetuate the self, leading to a profound state of selfless peace. The will to live is a pessimistic yet powerful philosophy. It forces us to acknowledge that a deep biological and irrational force underlies all our actions, and that genuine liberation may require a deliberate act of revolt against the very impulse that keeps us alive. Let's talk about the next philosophy idea. Hell is other people. The phrase, hell is other people, is one of the most famous and most misunderstood statements in modern philosophy. It comes from the final act of Jean-Paul Sartre's 1944 play, No Exit. The play features three dead strangers, Garcin, Inez, and Estelle, who are locked together in a single, windowless room, which they slowly realize is their eternal hell. They are not tortured by fire and pitchforks, they are tortured by each other. Sartre's claim is not a simple misanthropic grumble that people are annoying, difficult, or mean. It is a profound existential statement about the nature of the self, consciousness, and freedom. The self as object, the gaze. The core idea is the concept of the gaze, le regard. For Sartre, when you are alone, you are a subject. You are pure freedom and pure possibility. You define yourself in every moment. But the moment another person enters your world, you instantly become an object in their consciousness. They categorize you, judge you, and impose a fixed external definition upon you. When a stranger looks at you, you are no longer just you. You are the waiter, the rude man, or the nervous student. This external judgment, the gaze, fixes your freedom and freezes your possibilities. The internalized hell. The agony of the room in No Exit is the struggle to own one's own identity against the crushing weight of the other's judgment. Garcin, the coward, desperately tries to prove he is a hero, but every look from the cynical Inez freezes him in his cowardice. The hell is not the presence of the others, but the inescapable internalized presence of their judgment. You cannot escape yourself because every attempt to define yourself is immediately nullified by the way others see you. You are perpetually living for the other. The loss of freedom. For Sartre, to be a person is to be freedom, to always be able to choose and reinvent yourself. The gaze of the other is hell because it is the fundamental process that strips you of this absolute freedom. It forces you to see yourself as a static, defined object, which is the antithesis of the human condition. The only way for the characters in the room to escape the suffering would be to achieve total indifference to each other's opinions. But their deepest desire is to be seen and validated. This contradictory desire, the need for the other's attention, and the terror of their judgment, is the mechanism of their perpetual torment. Therefore, hell is other people means hell is the inevitable and destructive external judgment that transforms the fluid, free subject into a fixed, enslaved object. It is the terrifying realization that our own identity is forever contingent upon the consciousness of those around us. Let's talk about the next philosophy idea. Saden Nihilism. The concept of nihilism, the belief that life is without objective meaning, purpose, or intrinsic value, is often presented as a terrifying, depressing, or even angry philosophy. But there is a counter-response, one rooted not in despair, but in a peculiar form of liberation. This is the philosophy of Saden Nihilism, which is not a formal school of thought, but a term used to describe the emotional and psychological embrace of nihilism, shifting from sad to sadden, meaning to become comfortable or even happy with the lack of meaning. Imagine the classic nihilist who throws their hands up and says, "Nothing matters, so why bother?" The Saden nihilist looks at the same void of meaning and says, "Nothing matters, so everything is permissible." The argument for liberation. The Saden nihilist sees the absence of meaning not as a loss, but as the ultimate freedom from all external pressures. Freedom from cosmic imperative. If the universe has no inherent purpose, then there is no objective should. There is no divine law, no historical destiny, and no preordained role you must play. The pressure to live up to some grand external standard is instantly lifted. Freedom from social pressure. The Saden nihilist sees social norms, traditions, and moral frameworks as entirely arbitrary human constructions. They are not true in any cosmic sense. This perspective frees the individual from the debilitating anxiety of constantly seeking external validation. The only judgment that matters is their own. The shift from despair to acceptance. The core maneuver of Saden nihilism is the psychological pivot from disappointment to empowerment. The disappointment. We hoped the universe would offer a clear, comfortable answer to the question of why are we here? The empowerment. The universe did not answer. Therefore, we are now entirely responsible for creating our own answer. The ultimate freedom is the freedom to define value, meaning, and purpose for ourselves. The Saden nihilist does not cease to act. They simply act without the illusion of cosmic consequence. They engage in relationships, pursue art, and experience pleasure. But they do so knowing that these acts are self-chosen, temporary, and only valuable within the context they themselves have created. The irony of Saden nihilism is that by accepting that life has no objective meaning, the individual is freed to create a richer, more authentic subjective meaning. The pain of the realization gives way to the relief of the realization. It is a philosophy that offers a profound form of peace, a profound peace that comes from the quiet, confident surrender to meaninglessness, which in turn grants the only true purpose there is, the purpose you choose to define for yourself right now. Let's talk about the next philosophy idea, Dysteleological Suffering. The concept of dysteleological suffering addresses one of the most agonizing problems in the philosophy of religion and existential thought, the problem of evil and, specifically, the problem of suffering that appears to serve absolutely no purpose. Imagine the classic theological defense for pain. God allows suffering because it builds character, teaches compassion, or serves some ultimate, inscrutable divine plan. This is suffering with a teleology, a purpose or ultimate goal. Dysteleological suffering is the conceptual opposite. It is suffering that is so random, so vast, and so meaningless that it appears to serve no conceivable higher purpose whatsoever. The prefix dys denotes difficulty or badness, and teleology is the study of purpose. The argument of the meaningless. Consider a few classic examples of dysteleological suffering. The fawn in the forest. A young fawn is caught in a sudden raging forest fire. It suffers for hours, burning alive in agony before finally dying. No human is there to observe it, to learn from it, or to be inspired to be more compassionate. The suffering is purely private, serves no moral lesson, and results in no greater good. Infant pain. A newborn child dies in excruciating pain from a rare, quick-acting disease. The child is too young to learn any moral lesson, the parents are emotionally destroyed, and the death does not prevent future suffering. The pain is total, final, and seemingly pointless. The existence of this kind of suffering, suffering that is surplus, random, and unredeemable, poses a devastating intellectual challenge to the belief in an all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-good, omnibenevolent deity. If a benevolent God exists, why would God permit suffering that has no purpose, no character-building value, and no place in a grand cosmic plan? An all-powerful being could surely have achieved its ultimate ends without resorting to the agony of the innocent and the meaninglessness of the random tragedy. The secular embrace. Dysteleological suffering is a concept that is also embraced by secular existentialists. For them, the meaninglessness of suffering is simply a fact of existence. And it is precisely this lack of divine purpose that forces humanity to create its own meaning. In the secular view, the fawn's suffering is not a moral lesson. It is just a terrible, brute fact of the universe's indifference. The human response to this fact is not theological. It is ethical. Our moral duty is not to justify the suffering, but to actively work to alleviate it, precisely because the universe will not do so for us. Dysteleological suffering is a profound test of faith and philosophy. It demands an answer to the raw, visceral question of why evil exists, and its terrible conclusion that much of the pain in the world serves no ultimate purpose at all is often the final intellectual hurdle that either solidifies or shatters a person's faith. Let's talk about the next philosophy idea, abjection. The philosophical concept of abjection is most famously articulated by the psychoanalyst and philosopher Julia Kristeva in her 1980 work, Powers of Horror. It describes a powerful, visceral, and necessary reaction of revulsion that defines and protects the borders of the self. Abjection is not merely fear, disgust, or horror. It is the complex, instinctual loathing we feel for the things that have been violently cast out of the social or psychic order, but which threaten to collapse the boundary between the clean and the unclean, the self and the non-self. The formation of the self. Kristeva argues that abjection is essential to the formation of the self from infancy. For a self or a culture to exist, it must first define its borders. It must establish what is in here, the self, the body, the community, and what is out there, the world, the other, the danger. Abjection is the force that violently casts out the things that threaten the stability of this boundary. The ultimate objects of abjection are those materials that were once part of the body, but which have been expelled. Bodily wastes, feces, urine, vomit, blood, and pus. These were internal, a part of the self, but their expulsion makes them instantaneously and terrifyingly not self. The corpse. The dead body is the ultimate abjection. It is the most undeniable proof that the border between life and death, the fundamental division of the self, is fluid and can be crossed. The corpse is neither living nor fully other. It is a familiar object that has become monstrous. The social dimension. The individual psychic drama of abjection is mirrored in the formation of society and culture. Societies use abjection to define the borders of the community by casting out and demonizing groups or concepts that threaten the established social order. The unclean. Historically, taboos surrounding certain foods, diseases, or rituals are often forms of social abjection, rules designed to violently exclude the impure to maintain the purity and cohesion of the clean group. The marginalized. Groups that defy clear categorization, the liminal, the ambiguous, the sexually or socially fluid, often become social objects of abjection because they threaten to collapse the strict binary borders a society uses to define itself. The aesthetic response. The fascination with horror, gore, and extreme violence in art is often explained through abjection. We are drawn to these things precisely because they push the boundaries of the self. forcing us to confront the terrifying fluidity of our own existence. The experience of the abject is a necessary, albeit unpleasant, reminder of the fragile, porous, and constantly threatened border that constitutes our identity. In summary, abjection is the raw, visceral response to that which refuses to be neatly categorized, that which violates the borders of the self. It is the fundamental human loathing that underwrites our deepest instincts for separation, purity, and survival. Let's talk about the next philosophy idea: God is dead. The phrase "God is dead" is one of the most provocative and revolutionary pronouncements in the history of philosophy. It was delivered by the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, most famously in his 1882 book, The Gay Science. Nietzsche's statement is not an exclamation of atheist triumph or a claim about the actual existence of a deity. It is a mournful, profound cultural diagnosis. When Nietzsche says God is dead, he means that the belief in the Christian God and the entire moral and metaphysical framework that stemmed from that belief has lost its power to provide meaning, purpose, and moral order in Western civilization. The death as a cultural event. Nietzsche did not believe God had literally died. He believed humanity had effectively killed him through the rise of scientific rationalism, the Enlightenment, and secular humanism. We replaced faith with reason, biblical law with scientific law, and divine purpose with humanistic goals. The death of God is not a moment of celebration, but a moment of profound crisis. Nietzsche saw that once the foundation of God was removed, the entire structure of Western morality, which was entirely built on that foundation, would collapse. The coming of nihilism. The direct consequence of the death of God is nihilism. If there is no God, there is no divine plan. If there is no divine plan, there is no objective, pre-established purpose to human existence. If there is no objective purpose, then all action, all suffering, and all values are ultimately meaningless. Nietzsche viewed this approaching nihilism as the greatest danger in human history. He saw the 20th century facing a catastrophic loss of meaning, leading to psychological breakdown, existential despair, and potentially global wars fought over manufactured, desperate ideologies. The solution: the Übermensch, Overman. Nietzsche did not leave humanity in the void. He envisioned a solution that would emerge from the wreckage: the Übermensch, Overman. The Überman is the new human type who accepts the truth of the death of God and the meaninglessness of the universe. Instead of falling into nihilistic despair, the Überman bravely steps into the void to become a creator of new values. The Überman doesn't wait for a divine command. They invent their own purpose. The Überman affirms life in its entirety, its suffering, its joy, its randomness, without relying on any metaphysical crutch. God is dead is thus an invitation. It is the announcement of the greatest freedom and the greatest responsibility ever bestowed upon humanity: the freedom to define our own existence and the responsibility to create a value system worthy of life on earth. We are tasked with becoming gods to ourselves. Let's talk about the next philosophy idea: Being and Nothingness is the title of the monumental 1943 work by the French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre, and it is the defining text of 20th century existentialism. The work is a deep exploration of consciousness, freedom, and the ultimate nature of reality. Sartre divides all of existence into two fundamental modes of being: the being in itself and the being for itself. 1. Being in itself, en soi. This is the being of things. It is non-conscious, inert, and fixed. A rock, a chair, or a thought you had yesterday all exist in themselves. They simply are what they are. The being in itself has no choice, no freedom, and no consciousness. It is opaque, solid, and entirely defined by its physical properties. 2. Being for itself, pour soi. This is the being of human consciousness. It is dynamic, fluid, and defined by its nothingness. The being for itself is not a solid thing, because it is always what it is not yet. It is defined by its ability to question, to project into the future, and to deny or negate the current reality. This consciousness is an active whole in being. It is a vacuum, a nothingness. This nothingness is the source of all human freedom, as it means we are never entirely defined or fixed by our past or present. The primacy of freedom. Existence precedes essence. Sartre's famous slogan, "Existence precedes essence," is the central thesis of being and nothingness. For a paper knife, the essence, its function and definition, precedes its existence. The knife is made to cut. For a human being, we are born into the world, existence, as a blank slate, a pure nothingness. We have no predefined nature or soul, no essence. We spend our lives projecting ourselves into the future through our choices and actions, thereby creating our own essence. We are condemned to be free. The terror of nothingness, anguish. The being for itself is a source of profound human anguish. Because we are nothingness, we have no built-in guidance system, no fixed moral law, and no predefined purpose. Every choice we make is not just a choice for ourselves, but a choice that defines what humanity ought to be. This total responsibility is the source of anguish. This anguish is the terrifying realization that our freedom is absolute, and that our entire being is a continuous, self-made construction. The only way to escape this anguish is through bad faith, mauvaise foi, lying to ourselves by pretending we are a being in itself, claiming that we are fixed by our job, our past, or our predefined roles. But this flight from freedom is an inauthentic and self-deceptive way to live. The text is a radical call to embrace the absolute freedom and total responsibility of conscious existence. Let's talk about the next philosophy idea, eternal torment of samsara. The eternal torment of samsara is a central philosophical concept shared by the major dharmic traditions, including Hinduism, Buddhism, and Jainism. It is not merely a belief system, it is a profound cosmological and existential diagnosis of the human condition. Samsara, the wandering. The term samsara literally means wandering or cyclical flow. It describes the continuous, beginningless, and ultimately unsatisfying cycle of birth, life, death, and rebirth. It encompasses all realms of existence, from the lowest hells to the highest heavens, all of which are temporary and subject to the same relentless forces of change and decay. The torment of samsara is not primarily physical, it is psychological and existential. 1. The torment of impermanence, anicca. The deepest agony of samsara is the ceaseless recognition that all things are impermanent, anicca. Every joy, every love, every beautiful moment, and every pleasure is ultimately a transient state that must end. This impermanence renders all pursuit of happiness within the cycle ultimately futile. The joy you experience now is merely the seed of future suffering, as the clinging to that joy will cause pain when it inevitably vanishes. 2. The torment of dissatisfaction, dukkha. Samsara is fundamentally characterized by dukkha, a word often translated as suffering, but more accurately meaning dissatisfaction, stress, or the inability to satisfy. Even in the moments of greatest worldly success or pleasure, a subtle feeling of lack or anxiety remains. It is the feeling that the wheel of existence is constantly spinning, and no resting place can ever be found. 3. The fuel of the cycle, karma and avidya. The engine that drives this eternal torment is karma, action, fueled by avidya, ignorance. Ignorance is the fundamental delusion that the self or the world is a fixed, permanent entity. This ignorance causes clinging, attachment to things, people, and experiences, and aversion, avoidance of pain. These acts of clinging and aversion generate karma, which acts as the force that determines the nature of the next rebirth, perpetuating the cycle indefinitely. The solution, nirvana, moksha. The goal of all dharmic paths is to achieve nirvana in Buddhism or moksha in Hinduism, liberation from the cycle of samsara. This is not heaven. It is the absolute cessation of the will to cling. By dismantling the illusion of the permanent self and extinguishing the fires of craving and aversion, the karmic engine stops. The eternal torment of samsara is thus a powerful philosophical diagnosis. Human life is a restless, continuous pursuit of the temporary, and true peace can only be found by transcending the very will that forces us to wander in the first place. Let's talk about the next philosophy idea, the shadow. The concept of the shadow is a key component of the analytical psychology developed by the Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung. It is one of the most powerful and enduring archetypes in his model of the unconscious mind, and it is crucial to understanding psychological health. The shadow is the unconscious aspect of the personality that the conscious ego does not identify with itself. It is the sum of all the personal and collective qualities we reject, repress, and deny in ourselves, the dark, unlived, and often primitive part of our nature. The content of the shadow. The shadow is not simply evil, though it contains the potential for destructive behavior. It is better understood as a repository for the inferior traits, all the personality traits, weaknesses, and flaws we dislike, such as laziness, selfishness, inadequacy, or jealousy. We push these traits into the shadow to maintain a conscious self-image, the persona, of being good, hard-working, or kind. The unlived possibilities. It also contains positive qualities and impulses that we have rejected due to social pressure or fear. The capacity for spontaneous joy, wild creativity, or assertive power. A person who consciously strives to be meek and selfless often represses a powerful, assertive shadow. The projection of the shadow. The most dangerous aspect of the shadow is its tendency toward projection. Because we refuse to acknowledge our own dark side, the shadow's contents are often unconsciously projected onto other people, groups, or cultures. When a person obsessively criticizes a specific flaw in another, example, they are so arrogant, it is often the direct result of having repressed their own arrogant impulses. The external person becomes a convenient screen onto which they can safely see and judge their own denied traits. In the collective sense, social and political enemies are often defined by the negative traits that the collective society has repressed. The other becomes the embodiment of the shadow, justifying fear and hostility. The necessity of shadow work. For Jung, the central task of psychological development, the process of individuation, is the conscious confrontation and integration of the shadow. Confrontation. This involves the difficult, humbling process of consciously acknowledging that one possesses the undesirable traits and dark impulses that one judges in others. Integration. Integration does not mean acting out the dark impulses. It means incorporating the energy of the shadow into the conscious self. For example, a person who has integrated the repressed energy of their aggression shadow might not become violent, but they will gain the capacity for healthy assertiveness, self-defense, and setting firm boundaries. The shadow is not something to be destroyed, but something to be understood and embraced. The whole self, the complete and balanced self, can only be achieved when the light of consciousness is turned onto the darkness of the denied self. Let's talk about the next philosophy idea: misanthropy. Misanthropy is a philosophy or psychological disposition characterized by a general dislike, distrust, or contempt for the human species or human nature. It is not mere cynicism or occasional annoyance with people. It is a deep-seated, intellectual rejection of humanity as a whole. The misanthrope looks at the collective history of mankind and finds evidence of pervasive foolishness, selfishness, cruelty, and hypocrisy. Their contempt is not for a single individual, but for the inherent, flawed nature of the human animal. The philosophical roots of contempt. Misanthropy is often rooted in a disillusioned realism, built on a rigorous observation of the gap between human ideals and human actions. The failure of reason. The misanthrope observes that despite having the capacity for complex reason and scientific enlightenment, humanity repeatedly falls back into irrationality, superstition, and emotionally driven conflict. The species fails to live up to its own intellectual potential. The pervasiveness of hypocrisy. A core observation is that people profess high moral standards, honesty, generosity, peace, but consistently act out of petty self-interest, ego, and disguised aggression. The misanthrope sees the social mask, the persona, as a thin veneer covering a fundamentally base and self-serving core. The history of cruelty. The historical record is a central pillar of misanthropic thought. The continuous cycle of war, genocide, oppression, and environmental destruction is taken as definitive proof that the human species is a fundamentally destructive and tragic error of nature. Misanthropy versus cynicism. It is important to distinguish misanthropy from simple cynicism. Cynicism is a suspicion of the motives of others. The cynic believes people could be good, but are choosing to be selfish, and they are disappointed. Misanthropy is a conviction about the fixed nature of humanity. The misanthrope believes people cannot fundamentally change and are not worth the effort of being disappointed in. They are often calm in their contempt, having settled on the final negative assessment. The isolation of the misanthrope. While the misanthrope dislikes humanity, they do not necessarily hate all individuals. Often their philosophy leads to a paradoxical sense of lonely superiority. They see themselves as one of the few who possess the clarity to recognize the inherent flaws of the species. Some famous misanthropic figures, such as the character Alceste in Molière's The Misanthrope, struggle with the contradiction that they must live within a society they despise, leading to a perpetual state of alienation. Their integrity demands rejection of the flawed human world, but their human need for connection forces them back into it. Ultimately, misanthropy is a devastating intellectual judgment on the entire human project. It serves as a dark mirror, reflecting our collective moral failures and daring us to prove the assessment wrong.
Let's talk about the next philosophy idea: human sacrifice mythos. The human sacrifice mythos is not a formal philosophical school, but a pervasive, dark, and culturally formative idea that appears across human history. It is the deep-seated belief that for a society, a goal, or a god to be appeased, a single, innocent human life must be ritually and violently destroyed. The central function of this mythos is to create and enforce a profound moral economy built on the logic of exchange. Ultimate value demands ultimate cost. The core logic of the sacrifice. The power of the myth lies in its paradoxical and deeply spiritual calculation. The crisis. The community is facing an existential crisis, a famine, a plague, a war, or a crisis of moral order. The crisis is interpreted as a sign of divine or cosmic dissatisfaction. The ultimate commodity. The only commodity of sufficient value to appease an angry god or reverse a cosmic curse is an innocent human life. The life must be human because the problem is human. It must be innocent because the transaction must be one of pure value, untainted by deserved punishment. The transference of guilt, scapegoating. The death of the victim serves as a dramatic act of purification. The collective guilt, fear, and moral impurity of the entire community are symbolically transferred onto the body of the victim before they are destroyed. The victim becomes the scapegoat, who, through their death, clears the moral ledger for the remaining community. The guarantee of order. The sacrifice is a mechanism to violently re-establish order. The blood spilled is a guarantee that the gods have been satisfied, the crops will return, or the war will be won. It reestablishes the community's sense of control over a terrifying, chaotic universe. The modern echoes. While overt ritual sacrifice is largely a relic of the past, the human sacrifice mythos remains powerfully embedded in modern political and social psychology. Political scapegoating. A modern crisis, a financial collapse, a political scandal, is often solved not by systemic reform, but by the ritualistic destruction of a single individual or group, a CEO, a whistleblower, a political leader. This public political shaming serves the exact same function as ancient sacrifice, transferring diffuse collective guilt onto a single figure, satisfying the public's moral need for retribution, and allowing the system itself to continue unchanged. The heroic sacrifice. The myth is also inverted into a positive moral ideal, the willing sacrifice of one's life for the sake of the many, e.g., the soldier who jumps on the grenade. This heroic act still affirms the core principle that a single life can be exchanged for the survival or moral betterment of the group, underscoring the enduring power of the sacrificial transaction. The human sacrifice mythos is a dark, recurring theme that reveals humanity's deep and irrational belief that redemption and success can only be purchased at the ultimate price of an innocent's life.
Let's talk about the next philosophy idea: Death drive. The concept of the death drive, thanatos, is one of the most controversial and profound ideas introduced by the founder of psychoanalysis, Sigmund Freud, late in his career. It stands in stark opposition to the more intuitive life instinct, eros. Prior to the death drive, Freud believed that all human behavior was motivated by the life instinct, which encompasses the drive for survival, pleasure, and the creation of life, sexuality. However, after observing phenomena that seemed to defy the pleasure principle, such as trauma, repetition compulsion, and the mass destruction of World War I, Freud introduced the death drive. Thanatos, the instinct to return to the inorganic. The death drive is defined as a fundamental, unconscious, and universal drive in all living matter to return to a state of inorganic quietude, to return to the inanimate state from which life arose. It is an instinctual compulsion toward dissolution, stasis, and self-destruction. Freud saw the death drive as the expression of the nirvana principle, a force that seeks the complete elimination of all tension and stimulation. Since the ultimate state of no tension is death, the death drive is an impulse toward death itself. The manifestations of the death drive. Since the life instinct, eros, acts as a powerful counterbalance, the death drive rarely manifests as a direct, conscious desire for suicide. Instead, it is expressed indirectly in two primary ways. Self-directed aggression, repetition compulsion. The drive turns inward, manifesting as self-sabotage, masochism, and the compulsion to repeat traumatic experiences. For example, a person who repeatedly enters and destroys relationships is unconsciously acting out the death drive by recreating conditions that lead to emotional pain and eventual isolation. Other directed aggression, destructive impulse. The life instinct often forces the death drive to turn outward, manifesting as aggression, cruelty, hatred, and the urge to dominate and destroy others. All forms of human hostility, from petty arguments to organized warfare, are viewed as the death drive being successfully deflected from the self onto an external object. The war between eros and thanatos. Human life, according to this theory, is defined by the perpetual, epic struggle between the life instinct, eros, and the death drive, thanatos. Eros binds energy and seeks complexity, union, and the continuation of life. Thanatos unbinds energy and seeks simplicity, dissolution, and the return to inertia. Civilization itself is a grand, exhausting project of eros attempting to manage and control the aggressive, destructive impulses of thanatos. The necessity for law, morality, and social order is simply the collective attempt to prevent the species from acting out its own death wish. The death drive is a profoundly pessimistic philosophical concept. It denies the simplistic view of human nature as solely driven by pleasure and survival, positing instead that a dark, silent, self-annihilating impulse is woven into the very fabric of life. Let's talk about the next philosophy idea: nihilism. Nihilism is a philosophical stance that asserts that life is without objective meaning, purpose, intrinsic value, or comprehensible truth. The term itself is derived from the Latin word nihil, meaning nothing. Nihilism is not a single, unified doctrine, but rather a spectrum of beliefs that deny the reality or knowability of ultimate value. It provides a devastating conclusion to the search for an external, universal justification for human existence. The core tenets of nihilism. The philosophy is generally categorized into several major branches: Existential nihilism. This is the most common form. It asserts that life has no external purpose, meaning, or value. We were not put here for a reason. The universe is indifferent to our existence. The implication is that since no purpose is given, all human efforts and achievements are ultimately meaningless in the cosmic scheme. Moral nihilism, ethical nihilism. This branch asserts that there are no objective moral facts or absolute truths about right and wrong. Moral values are merely social constructions, subjective opinions, or emotional expressions. Therefore, it is never objectively true that an action is good or evil. Epistemological nihilism. This is a radical skepticism that asserts that knowledge itself is impossible. We can never truly know anything with certainty, and therefore all attempts to establish truth or knowledge are ultimately futile. The crisis of nihilism, the void. As articulated by Friedrich Nietzsche, the spread of nihilism is a crisis for Western civilization. The Enlightenment and the rise of science eroded the foundation of religious belief, and when God was removed, the entire structure of objective morality, meaning, and truth collapsed with him. The initial experience of realizing nihilism is often one of despair and disorientation. If nothing matters, then why struggle? Why be moral? Why create? This often leads to a paralyzing sense of futility and a detachment from conventional life. Responses to the nihilistic conclusion. The philosophical task after acknowledging nihilism is not to cure it, but to find a way to live with it. Various thinkers propose different routes out of the despair. Existentialism, Sartre-Camus, accepts that the universe is meaningless, but insists that humans are therefore radically free to create their own subjective meaning and value. The purpose of life becomes the act of defying the void by choosing a life of passionate engagement. The Übermensch, Nietzsche. The overman embraces the meaninglessness and becomes a sovereign creator of new, life-affirming values that replace the old, dead moral order. Ultimately, nihilism is a challenging mirror to human delusion. It strips away comforting illusions and forces the individual to bear the total weight of their own existence. It compels the question, if nothing outside of you gives your life meaning, can you be brave enough to create it yourself? Let's talk about the next philosophy idea. Radical skepticism. Radical skepticism is an extreme philosophical position that casts fundamental doubt upon the possibility of acquiring knowledge or establishing any absolute objective truth about the external world. Unlike ordinary skepticism, which doubts a specific claim, radical skepticism doubts the very capacity of the human mind to know anything at all. The roots of radical skepticism trace back to the ancient Greek Pyrrhonism, but it found its most forceful modern expression in the work of René Descartes, who used it as a methodological tool. The methodological doubt. Radical skepticism begins with a systematic application of doubt. To accept any belief as true, a person must first be absolutely certain that there is no possibility of error. The radical skeptic quickly identifies the two main sources of all human knowledge and demonstrates their unreliability. Senses, empirical data. Our senses are constantly deceiving us. We experience optical illusions, hallucinations, and misperceptions. If our senses have deceived us even once, we cannot be certain that they are not deceiving us now. Reason, logical deduction. Even our reason can be flawed. We make logical errors, miscalculate, and can be subject to psychological biases. Since the two avenues to knowledge are flawed, the skeptic introduces thought experiments to prove that we cannot be certain of the foundation of our reality. The most famous include the evil demon. Descartes asked us to imagine an all-powerful, supremely malicious demon dedicated to deceiving us about everything, including the simplest mathematical truths and the existence of our own bodies. The brain in a vat. As explored previously, if a perfect computer can feed our brain all our current sensory data, then we have no way of knowing whether we are in the real world or a simulated reality. The conclusion of unknowability. The radical skeptic argues that because the possibility of a deceiving demon or a brain in a vat can never be logically ruled out, we are not entitled to claim genuine knowledge of the external world. The only knowledge we can truly claim is the internal, undeniable fact of our own consciousness. Descartes' cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. Everything outside of that consciousness is potentially unknowable. The practical paradox. The practical life of a radical skeptic becomes a paradox. While the philosophy dictates that they should suspend all judgment, they still walk on the sidewalk, eat their dinner, and avoid stepping in front of buses. This highlights the difference between philosophical certainty, which is impossible, and practical certainty, which is necessary for daily life. Radical skepticism serves as a powerful intellectual challenge. It forces us to acknowledge that the comfortable belief in an objective, knowable reality is ultimately an act of faith in the reliability of our own cognitive equipment. A faith that the rigorous demands of philosophy cannot definitively justify. Let's talk about the next philosophy idea, the silence of God. The concept of the silence of God is a profound philosophical and theological dilemma that addresses the perceived absence of divine communication or intervention in the face of human suffering and moral chaos. It is a central theme in existentialist theology, especially following the trauma of the 20th century. It is not merely an argument for atheism, but a meditation on the nature of faith when the divine is experienced as absent, distant, or tragically indifferent. The problem of absent theodicy. The philosophical problem of evil, theodicy, attempts to reconcile the existence of suffering with the existence of an all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-good God. The traditional answers often propose a divine plan, free will, or a test of faith. The silence of God is the realization that in the most critical moments of human history, genocide, plague, or personal tragedy, God's response is overwhelmingly silence. The promised intervention, the clear moral guidance, or the compassionate explanation never arrives. If a person prays for a miraculous cure and only the silence of the room answers, the believer is forced to reckon not with God's absence, but with God's refusal to speak. The silence is experienced as an ontological fact, a vast, cold indifference that renders human suffering isolated and ultimately meaningless on a cosmic scale. The existential interpretation. For existentialist thinkers, particularly those influenced by thinkers like Søren Kierkegaard, the silence of God is not a flaw in the universe, but the essential condition of genuine faith. The necessity of the leap. If God were to speak clearly, if a divine voice boomed from the heavens or a miracle occurred on demand, faith would become knowledge. There would be no uncertainty and thus no need for the existential leap of faith. The burden of freedom. The silence is what gives humanity its terrifying full freedom. In the absence of clear divine commands, humans are forced to create their own meaning and moral code. The silence makes moral action authentic, as it is chosen freely and without coercion, rather than being an act of simple obedience. The literary and cultural echo. The silence of God is a central motif in modern literature and cinema, often reflecting the trauma of the Holocaust and the subsequent loss of faith in rational order. The most powerful expressions of the theme do not deny God's existence, but lament the apparent withdrawal of God's presence. The philosophical implication is that the modern believer must forge a faith against the evidence. The authentic religious life is one lived in the terrible freedom of the void, where the true test is not believing despite the suffering, but believing despite the silence that accompanies the suffering. The faith that remains after confronting the silence is, arguably, the most profound and genuine kind of belief possible.
Let's talk about the next philosophy idea: antinatalism. Antinatalism is a philosophical position that assigns a negative value to birth, arguing that it is morally wrong for humans to procreate. It holds that coming into existence is, on balance, a harm, and therefore humans have a moral duty to cease bringing new sentient beings into the world. Anti-nihilism is a radical ethical stance that challenges the most fundamental biological and social instincts of the human species. The core argument: asymmetry of harm. The most influential argument for antinatalism is the asymmetry of harm put forth by the South African philosopher David Benatar. The argument rests on the following premises. The harm of pain, negative value. The presence of pain is bad. If a child is born and experiences suffering, that is a genuine, undeniable harm. The benefit of pleasure, absence of harm. The absence of pain is good. If a child is never born, they are not harmed by the absence of pain. The harm of non-existence, no harm. The absence of pleasure is not bad unless someone exists who is being deprived of it. If a child is never born, no one is being deprived of pleasure, so no harm is done. The conclusion: bringing a person into existence creates the possibility of severe harm, suffering, where none existed before, and there is no comparable harm created by not bringing them into existence. The moral ledger is inherently unbalanced against procreation. The critique of benevolence. The antinatalist views procreation as an inherently selfish act. When parents decide to have a child, they are doing so to satisfy their own desires for legacy, love, or personal fulfillment, and are forcing the child to endure the risks of life, disease, loss, existential dread, and inevitable death, all for the sake of the parent's fulfillment. The antinatalist asks, is it truly possible to be a benevolent parent if you are knowingly imposing the inherent suffering and ultimate tragedy of existence onto an unwilling, non-consenting party? The response to existentialism. Antinatalism is often discussed in relation to existentialism, which holds that humans must create their own meaning. The antinatalist argues that while it is possible to create subjective meaning, this meaning is insufficient to justify the involuntary imposition of severe suffering. The existence of a single terrible tragedy, like severe lifelong illness, outweighs the value of all the subjective happiness one might create. The final goal of antinatalism is the voluntary, peaceful extinction of the human species. By ceasing procreation, humanity would prevent all future inevitable suffering. It is a philosophy driven by an extreme, uncompromising form of compassion for all sentient beings.
Let's talk about the next philosophy idea, ontological suffering. Ontological suffering is a philosophical and existential concept that refers to a deep, unavoidable, and fundamental anxiety or pain inherent in the very condition of being, ontology. It is suffering that is not caused by specific external events like a toothache, a war, or a broken heart, but by the conscious awareness of one's own finite, contingent existence. It is the suffering of the soul that realizes its own nature. The four pillars of ontological suffering. This category of suffering is most fully explored by existentialists and depth psychologists, who identify four primary sources of this inherent anxiety: the terror of death, the inevitable end. The most fundamental source of ontological suffering is the awareness of one's own finiteness. Unlike other animals, humans know that they are going to die. This knowledge creates an ever-present unconscious dread. The pain is not the fear of the act of dying, but the terror of non-being, the complete and final erasure of consciousness and all possibilities. The burden of freedom, the anguish of choice. As articulated by Jean-Paul Sartre, humans are defined by their radical freedom. We are condemned to be free. This is suffering because every choice we make is made in a vacuum, without any divine or pre-established moral guidance. Every choice is the full, terrifying burden of being entirely responsible for the meaning and outcome of our own lives. This total responsibility is called anguish. The pain of isolation, existential aloneness. Despite our social connections, we realize that there is a fundamental, unbridgeable gap between our subjective consciousness and that of another person. We are born alone and we die alone. We can never truly know what it is like to be another person. This awareness of ultimate existential aloneness, the inability to fully merge our consciousness with another, is a profound source of pain. The search for meaning, the void of meaninglessness. The human mind is a meaning-making apparatus, yet the cosmos offers no objective, predefined meaning. We suffer from the realization that we must create our own purpose, the will to meaning. This process is constantly threatened by the realization of its own constructed subjective nature. The suffering here is the tension between the passionate creation of meaning and the cold, indifferent silence of the universe. Ontological suffering is not something that can be fixed by therapy, wealth, or social change. It is the cost of consciousness. It is the inherent pain we pay for the privilege of knowing we exist, that we are free, and that we will end. The philosophical task is to confront this inherent suffering and, through that confrontation, find a way to affirm life despite its ultimate meaninglessness.
Let's talk about the next philosophical idea, moral nihilism. Moral nihilism is the meta-ethical view that nothing is intrinsically morally right or wrong. It asserts that objective moral facts do not exist, and therefore all moral claims such as murder is wrong or charity is good are false, not truth-apt, or entirely meaningless. Moral nihilism is a radical philosophical conclusion that challenges the foundation of all ethical and legal systems. It is a subset of the broader philosophy of nihilism, which denies all objective meaning and value. The argument against objective morality. The moral nihilist typically rests their case on the failure of philosophy to ever find a source for absolute moral truth. Their argument often proceeds along these lines. The absence of moral facts. We can scientifically verify the existence of atoms, planets, and biological processes. We cannot, however, observe or verify the existence of a moral fact or a moral property in the universe. There is nothing in the fabric of reality that makes the action of kindness inherently better than the action of cruelty. The relativity of moral systems. Morality varies wildly across cultures, historical periods, and religions. If there were a singular, objective moral law, one would expect it to be uniform and unchanging, much like the laws of physics. The vast differences suggest that morality is a subjective, cultural construct, not a universal truth. The rejection of moral authority. Moral nihilism rejects all claims of objective moral authority, whether they come from a divine being, a secular human law, or a Platonic ideal. These are all dismissed as human inventions designed to impose order and control. Variations of moral nihilism. Moral nihilism is often expressed through two related yet distinct theories. Error theory. This position, championed by philosopher J.L. Mackie, argues that all moral statements are actually attempts to describe objective moral facts. But since those facts do not exist, all moral statements are literally false. When someone says stealing is wrong, they are making a claim that is in error, much like claiming the earth is flat. Expressivism. This position argues that moral statements are not factual claims at all. When someone says stealing is wrong, they are not stating a universal truth. They are simply expressing a personal feeling or commanding an action. The statement is equivalent to saying boo to stealing or don't steal. It is a statement of emotion, not a statement of fact. The practical consequence. The immediate, terrifying practical consequence of moral nihilism is that it permits all action. If there is no objective moral restraint, then acts of compassion and acts of murder are ultimately on the same ethical plane. Neither is objectively better or worse. Most moral philosophers use this extreme conclusion as a reductio ad absurdum to argue that moral nihilism must be false, because a world without moral restraints is intolerable. However, the moral nihilist simply replies that the world is indeed morally arbitrary, and our ethical systems are merely the desperate, temporary attempts of one species to avoid chaos.
Let's talk about the next philosophy idea. Cosmic horror, or Lovecraftian horror, is a philosophical subgenre of horror fiction and a specific perspective on existence that centers on the terrifying realization of humanity's utter insignificance in the face of an infinite, chaotic, and fundamentally alien universe. It is a philosophy of terror rooted not in the fear of the unknown, but the fear of unthinkable knowledge. The core tenets of cosmic horror. The experience of cosmic horror is defined by four core philosophical realizations that shatter the human perspective. The insignificance of humanity, the indifferent cosmos,
Cosmic horror asserts that humanity is a fleeting, accidental species inhabiting a tiny speck of dust in a cosmos of unimaginable scale. The universe is not hostile to us, it is simply indifferent. The stars, the deep voids, and the colossal entities that inhabit them do not know we exist, and if they did, they wouldn't care. Our fears, loves, and achievements have no cosmic significance whatsoever. The breakdown of physical law, the unknowable. The terror is often triggered by an encounter with an entity or phenomenon that violates the known laws of physics, time, and geometry. The appearance of a Cthulhu or a monstrous geometrical structure forces the observer to realize that their entire rational, ordered worldview is a fragile, convenient illusion. Reality is much stranger, more fluid, and more chaotic than the human mind can withstand. The limits of reason, the truth that drives you mad. The ultimate horror is not being killed, but the loss of one's sanity through the acquisition of forbidden knowledge. The ancient, monstrous entities, often called the Great Old Ones, are so vast and their nature so alien that to truly comprehend them is to realize the ultimate meaninglessness of human concepts like morality, time, and truth. The mind, being a small, evolved tool for planetary survival, simply breaks upon touching this ultimate reality. The lack of redemption. In traditional horror, the monster can be defeated and the moral order can be restored. In cosmic horror, the monstrous truth, the universe's indifference, is eternal, and the beings are often sleeping or simply waiting. There is no hope, no salvation, and no final victory. The best possible outcome is usually a temporary return to blissful ignorance. Cosmic horror is a powerful, pessimistic philosophical stance. It suggests that our comforting systems of meaning, our religions, our sciences, and our social structures are merely little walls we have built to keep out the vast, cold truth of the cosmos. The moment those walls crack, the only human response is not bravery or wisdom, but an inevitable self-protective plunge into madness.
Let's talk about the next philosophy idea. Negative utilitarianism, NU, is a variation of the ethical theory of utilitarianism that holds that the primary moral goal should not be to maximize pleasure or happiness, but to minimize suffering or negative utility. It is a philosophy driven by the profound moral asymmetry between good and bad. The intuition that the moral urgency of preventing pain is far greater than the moral urgency of creating pleasure. The core principle of asymmetry. The negative utilitarian argues that bad things, suffering, pain, loss, are morally weightier than good things, pleasure, joy, gain. Imagine a choice where you can prevent one person from experiencing intense, chronic suffering for a year, or you can make 1 million people slightly happier for a year. The classical utilitarian would weigh the vast amount of positive pleasure against the single source of pain. The negative utilitarian would argue that the moral imperative to alleviate the intense suffering is so overwhelming that it trumps the aggregation of minor pleasures. Pain has a moral veto power over joy. The radical implications of NU. When taken to its logical extreme, negative utilitarianism leads to profound and often radical conclusions that are far removed from classical utilitarianism. The case for euthanasia and antinatalism. Since the only way to guarantee the absence of future suffering is the absence of future life, extreme forms of NU can logically support the cessation of all future life, antinatalism, and the promotion of voluntary euthanasia to end all existing suffering. The ultimate state of minimal suffering is, after all, the cessation of all sentient existence. The problem of the happy minority. NU can justify causing massive displeasure to a majority if doing so alleviates intense suffering in a minority. For example, if a painful but curable disease only affects a small group, the NU could argue for diverting all global resources, causing widespread poverty and mild unhappiness, if that is the fastest way to eliminate the intense suffering of the sick minority. The focus on the worst off. In its more moderate and practical forms, negative utilitarianism serves as a powerful ethical framework that focuses moral attention on the needs of the worst off and the prevention of catastrophic outcomes. Instead of constantly striving for some vague higher plane of universal happiness, the moral duty is to identify and eliminate the most intense sources of human and animal pain. It provides a strong ethical basis for medical research, poverty reduction, and effective altruism focused solely on the most acute areas of global need. The fundamental value of negative utilitarianism is that it acts as a moral safeguard against the tyranny of the majority. It warns that an ethical system that simply sums up pleasure can be morally blind to the intense, non-negotiable suffering of the individual. It suggests that the moral life is primarily a struggle against pain, not a hedonistic pursuit of joy. Let's talk about the next philosophy idea, determinism. Determinism is a core philosophical thesis that asserts that for every event, including every human action, there are prior events and conditions that inevitably cause it. Simply put, the future is fixed. Given the state of the universe at any one moment, the laws of nature allow for only one possible subsequent state. Determinism is the direct antithesis of the concept of free will. The causal chain. The determinist view is built on the concept of the causal chain. Every event is a link in an unbroken, beginningless, and endless chain of cause and effect. Your decision to read this script was caused by the firing of specific neurons in your brain. The firing of those neurons was caused by chemical processes. Those chemical processes were caused by your diet, your genetics, and the history of light hitting your retina. Your diet and genetics were caused by your parents, the economic environment, and ultimately the initial conditions of the Big Bang. The determinist argues that a scientist could know the exact position and momentum of every particle in the universe at any one time, and possessed a full understanding of all the laws of physics. They could, in principle, calculate every future event, including every one of your future choices. Your sense of choosing is merely the subjective experience of the unfolding of a preset program. Variations of determinism. Hard determinism. This is the strong, uncompromising position. It accepts the causal chain and concludes that because all our actions are determined by factors outside of our control, the past, the laws of nature, free will is an illusion. Our moral responsibility is therefore also called into question, as a person cannot be truly responsible for an action they could not have avoided. Soft determinism, compatibilism. This position attempts to reconcile determinism with free will. It argues that our actions are determined, but that we can still be considered free if our determined actions are the result of our own desires, reasons, and motives. An action is free if it comes from the internal state of the person, even if that internal state was ultimately determined by the past. The moral system is preserved, as the person is still the source of the action. The implications for morality. The greatest challenge of hard determinism is the erosion of moral accountability.
If a criminal's actions were the inevitable result of their genes, their upbringing, and their environment, how can we justly punish them? Punishment is simply another determined event in the chain. The determinist might argue that punishment is justified not as retribution for a free choice, but as a necessary and determined deterrent for future determined actions. Determinism is a powerful intellectual framework that forces us to question the deepest intuition of human experience, the feeling that our will is sovereign and our choices are truly our own.
Let's talk about the next philosophy idea, the myth of Sisyphus. The myth of Sisyphus is the central image used by the French philosopher Albert Camus to illustrate the core problem of his philosophy: the absurd. Imagine the ancient Greek figure Sisyphus. For offending the gods, he was condemned to an eternal punishment. He must forever push a massive rock up a mountain, only to have the rock roll back down to the valley the moment it reaches the summit. He then descends the mountain, knowing the rock waits, and begins the labor again, for all eternity. Sisyphus's torment is not primarily the physical labor. It is the knowledge of its futility. He is engaged in an effort that is eternally defeated, a fate without hope of resolution or escape. Camus argues that Sisyphus's condition is the perfect metaphor for the human condition itself. We wake up, go to work, build relationships, strive for goals, and seek ultimate meaning, only to have the universe respond with indifferent silence. We search for rational answers in a world that is fundamentally irrational. The human need for meaning meets the universe's lack of meaning, and this confrontation is the essence of the absurd. The central question Camus poses is, faced with this eternal, meaningless struggle, should we despair? Should we commit philosophical suicide by denying the absurd, or physical suicide by ending the struggle? Camus argues for a third way: revolt and affirmation. The moment of philosophical triumph is the descent. When Sisyphus walks back down the mountain, he is fully conscious. He is aware of the futility of his task, the crushing silence of the gods, and the inevitable recurrence of his fate. In this moment of full, clear-sighted awareness, he transcends his punishment. His revolt is not a physical attempt to escape, but a conscious rejection of the value of the god's judgment. By acknowledging the absurdity of his task without hope, without illusion, and without despair, he separates his will from the demands of the gods. The passion he puts into his struggle, the sheer human effort, becomes the meaning itself. The goal is to live life knowing the rock will roll down, but acting anyway. The meaning of life is not given. It is created by the intensity and courage of the revolt against its essential meaninglessness. Sisyphus, in Camus' final, famous line, must be imagined happy. His happiness is the joy of the conquered man who refuses to be spiritually defeated. His fate is his own.
Let's talk about the next philosophy idea: animal sacrifice in Theodicy. The concept of animal sacrifice in Theodicy addresses a subtle yet profound theological and ethical problem. If God is all-powerful and all-good, why does God permit the vast, unrelenting suffering of non-human animals in the natural world? This suffering, often termed natural evil, is not caused by human free will. The term animal sacrifice here is a philosophical metaphor, suggesting that the suffering of the non-human world is, in effect, a massive, ongoing, cosmic sacrifice that seems to serve no immediate, comprehensible moral purpose. The problem of predatory suffering. The core of the issue lies in the cycle of predation, disease, and slow, agonizing death that is endemic to the natural world. A gazelle is slowly and terrifyingly torn apart by a lion, not because of a moral choice it made, but because the lion must eat to survive. Millions of animals suffer from crippling diseases and mass die-offs, completely independent of human intervention. If traditional theodicy argues that human suffering is necessary for moral development to build character, compassion, and free will, this argument entirely fails when applied to the animal world. Animals cannot develop moral character, and their suffering often goes completely unobserved by humans, providing no lesson for us. The sheer, gratuitous suffering of the animal kingdom is, on its face, dysteleological. It appears to serve no purpose. The theological responses. Philosophers and theologians who maintain a benevolent God have struggled with this animal theodicy. The blind natural order. Some argue that the suffering is not directly willed by God, but is an unavoidable side effect of a dynamic, autonomous, and beautiful natural order. God willed the system of life, and the system, by its very nature, requires consumption and death. The goodness of the total, complex ecosystem outweighs the localized suffering of the individual. The eschatological hope. Some religious traditions posit that animal suffering will be redeemed in a final, perfect state of being, heaven or a new earth. This view shifts the burden of justification from the present to the eschatological future, arguing that the divine goodness is revealed in the final, total restoration of all creation. The subtlety of consciousness. A more radical philosophical response questions the depth of animal suffering, arguing that animals may lack the human capacity for anticipation of death, existential dread, and sustained self-reflection. Their suffering, while real, is perhaps not the profound, cumulative agony that human suffering is. Regardless of the proposed solution, the concept of animal sacrifice in theodicy remains a powerful challenge. It forces the believer to acknowledge that the vast majority of suffering in the universe is a matter of blind natural processes, and that any divine plan that includes the necessary, endless torment of the innocent non-human world is a plan that is deeply inscrutable and ethically terrifying to the human mind. Let's talk about the next philosophy idea: terror management theory. Terror management theory, TMT, is a major psychological and philosophical theory proposed by social psychologists Jeff Greenberg, Sheldon Solomon, and Tom Pieszczynski. It asserts that nearly all human cultural and social behavior is fundamentally motivated by the need to manage and suppress the paralyzing, unique terror that arises from the awareness of one's own inevitable death. The core conflict. The theory is based on a profound existential conflict that defines the human experience: the biological instinct for self-preservation. Like all living things, humans are biologically wired to survive and avoid death. The cognitive awareness of death. Unlike other animals, humans possess advanced cognitive capacities that allow us to realize that death is certain, final, and can occur at any moment. This conflict, the biological drive to live, clashing with the intellectual certainty of death, creates a unique potential for crippling terror. To function without paralyzing anxiety, the mind must construct psychological defenses to manage this terror. The two primary defenses. TMT argues that all human culture, society, and personal identity are defense mechanisms against the terror of mortality. Cultural worldview. This is the shared, socially constructed belief system that provides a sense of order, permanence, and meaning to an otherwise chaotic and meaningless universe. This includes religion, national identity, political ideologies, and shared values. By investing faith in a worldview, a person gains a promise of literal or symbolic immortality. Literal immortality, the promise of an afterlife or reincarnation, religion. Symbolic immortality, the promise that one will live on through one's children, nation, great works, or reputation, culture and legacy. By conforming to the standards of the culture, the individual gains a sense of worth and is granted a place in the eternal narrative of the group. Self-esteem. Self-esteem is defined by TMT as the belief that one is a valuable, contributing member of the cultural worldview. High self-esteem is the feeling of successfully fulfilling the roles and standards set by the culture. This is the individual's passport to symbolic immortality. The effect of mortality salience. The theory is backed by numerous experiments that demonstrate the effects of mortality salience, making the subject's own death psychologically prominent. When subjects are reminded of their death, they exhibit predictable defensive behaviors. They show greater aggression toward people who violate their worldview, e.g., immigrants, political rivals. They show greater attachment and devotion to their own national flag or cultural symbols. They show a greater desire to have children or create lasting works. In summary, terror management theory offers a totalizing, pessimistic view of human motivation. It suggests that our highest cultural achievements, our most vicious prejudices, and our deepest sense of personal worth are all elaborate, unconscious psychological defenses created to keep the inevitable, terrifying truth of our own mortality at bay. We are, at base, a species terrified of death.
Let's talk about the next philosophy idea: bundle theory of self. The bundle theory of self is a prominent metaphysical position that offers a radical answer to the question of personal identity. Most famously associated with the Scottish philosopher David Hume, it asserts that the self, or the mind, is not a continuous, enduring substance or soul, but rather a mere bundle or collection of constantly changing perceptions. Imagine looking inward and attempting to find the core, the essence, the singular I that persists beneath all your thoughts and feelings. Hume claimed that whenever he looked for this unified self, he could only ever find a specific, momentary perception, a sensation of heat, a memory of a face, a fleeting feeling of anger, or a passing thought about dinner. He could never catch himself without a perception, and he could never find the self behind the perceptions. The bundle theory concludes that the self is nothing more than this collection of perceptions that succeed each other with inconceivable rapidity and are in a perpetual flux and movement. The mind is a kind of theater where perceptions pass and repass, but there is no singular stage manager, no enduring substance, and no fixed spectator watching the show. The continuous self we feel we possess is a comfortable illusion created by the laws of association, specifically the principles of contiguity, closeness in time, and resemblance, similarity. Because the memory you have now resembles the memory you had an hour ago, your mind smoothly stitches them together and mistakes this resemblance for genuine, substantial identity. This theory has profound implications for our intuitive understanding of the self. First, it is a direct rejection of the substance theory of self, which holds that there is an underlying, unchanging spiritual or mental substrate, a soul or Cartesian ego, that holds all the perceptions together. The bundle theory dissolves this substance, arguing that the self is simply the phenomena, the collection itself. Second, it eliminates the idea of an immortal soul in the traditional sense. If the self is just a temporary, fleeting collection of perceptions, then the dissolution of the body and the end of the collection means the complete end of the self. There is no enduring substance left to pass on to an afterlife. Finally, the bundle theory suggests that the entire concept of a continuous, responsible personal identity is an invention of language and convenience. The difference between a person today and that same person 40 years ago is so vast that the term same person is merely a linguistic shorthand. The self is better conceived as a river, a constant flow of water molecules, none of which stay the same, but which we label with a continuous name. The bundle theory is a challenging, radical call to recognize the fluid, ephemeral, and non-substantial nature of the inner life.
Let's talk about the next philosophy idea: the problem of other minds. The problem of other minds is a fundamental philosophical problem that questions how we can know or even be rationally justified in believing that other human beings possess conscious minds, subjective experiences, and feelings similar to our own. The problem arises from the necessary privacy of consciousness. You have direct, immediate, and infallible access to your own thoughts, pains, and sensations. You know with absolute certainty that you are experiencing the world right now. However, you have no direct access to the consciousness of anyone else. All you can observe are their external behaviors, their speech, their movements, their facial expressions, and their physical reactions. The philosophical dilemma is this: how do we bridge the gap from observing a person's physical body and behavior to logically concluding that there is an internal, conscious, subjective mental life going on inside them? Historically, two main approaches have been proposed to solve this problem, both of which face severe limitations. The first approach is the argument from analogy. This argument starts with the unquestionable fact of your own consciousness. You know that when you stub your toe and cry out, your crying out is caused by an internal feeling of pain. When you see another person stub their toe and cry out, you assume that because their external behavior, crying out, is analogous to your own, the internal cause, pain, must also be analogous. However, the argument from analogy is weak because it relies on generalizing from a single case, your own, to a universal conclusion. Logically, this is insufficient proof. The second approach is inference to the best explanation. This argument suggests that the simplest and most plausible explanation for the complex, creative, and purposeful behavior of other people is that they possess conscious minds like our own. The alternative, that everyone else is a mere philosophical zombie, a being that looks and acts human but has no inner conscious life, is an incredibly complex and bizarre hypothesis. Therefore, the hypothesis of other minds is the most economical and best explanation. The problem remains unsolved because neither analogy nor inference provides the absolute certainty that the skeptic demands. The philosopher can never truly eliminate the possibility of the philosophical zombie. The problem of other minds is not merely an academic puzzle. It is the source of much of our social anxiety and moral uncertainty. The difficulty of truly knowing another person's mind, their intentions, their feelings, their true self, is what makes empathy an act of imaginative projection rather than simple observation. The problem shows that while we assume shared consciousness for practical life, the ultimate confirmation of another mind remains a permanent logical mystery. Let's talk about the next philosophy idea, causa sui. The concept of causa sui is a profound metaphysical idea rooted in Latin, meaning cause of itself. It refers to something that is self-generating, self-creating, and dependent on no external factor for its existence. It is the ultimate expression of complete independence. The idea has appeared throughout the history of philosophy, primarily in discussions of God, substance, and ultimate reality. In classical Western theology and metaphysics, causa sui is often used as a definition or a necessary attribute of God. If God is the ultimate creator of all things, then God cannot himself have been created by anything external. To avoid an infinite regress of causes, A created B, B created C, and so on, there must be a starting point, an uncaused cause. Causa sui posits that this first cause must be its own reason for existence. God is the being whose essence is to exist, making him the only truly self-sufficient entity. The philosopher Baruch Spinoza also made causa sui central to his monistic system. For Spinoza, there is only one substance, which he called God or nature. This substance is all-encompassing, and since it is everything, it cannot be caused by anything outside of itself. Therefore, Spinoza's single substance is causa sui. It is its own explanation and ultimate foundation. The concept is considered a logical impossibility by some philosophers, most notably Friedrich Nietzsche, who critiqued it as the ultimate expression of human vanity and faulty reasoning. Nietzsche saw the belief in causa sui as the ultimate attempt to invent a reason for one's own existence, thereby rejecting the chaotic, random, and contingent nature of reality. He viewed the desire for causa sui as an expression of the will to power, an irrational attempt to be absolutely self-responsible and free of dependency. However, the modern psychological application of causa sui relates to existentialism. While no human can be a causa sui in the metaphysical sense, the concept captures the goal of radical human freedom. The existentialist strives to define their own essence through their choices and actions. They choose their own values and live without appealing to a divine or social template. In this psychological sense, the self strives to become its own cause, its own ultimate justification. The human effort to overcome the randomness of birth and create a self that is defined by its own authentic will is the psychological realization of causa sui. Ultimately, the idea of causa sui represents the search for the absolute beginning, the final, complete, and self-contained explanation for existence. Whether as a theological absolute or as a psychological ideal, it is the ultimate philosophical expression of being wholly and perfectly independent. Let's talk about the next philosophy idea, beginning towards death. The phrase being towards death, sein zum Tode, is the central concept in the existential phenomenology of the German philosopher Martin Heidegger, most famously articulated in his 1927 masterwork, Being and Time. It is not a morbid contemplation, but a necessary analytical tool for understanding the true nature of human existence, which Heidegger terms Dasein. Heidegger argues that Dasein, the human being, is defined not just by its birth and its present moment, but fundamentally by its end. Unlike a chair or a tree, a human life is a whole that can only be understood by grasping its totality, which includes its conclusion. Being towards death is not merely the biological certainty that we will die. It is the continuous, conscious awareness that our life is finite and that death is our ownmost, non-relational, and certain possibility. Ownmost. Death is always my death. No one can die it for me. It is the one possibility that is absolutely unique to my existence and cannot be shared. Non-relational. Death fundamentally dissolves all relationships. It is the final severing of all ties, proving that the self is, in its ultimate core, utterly alone. Certain, yet indefinite. We know with absolute certainty that death is coming, but its time is completely indefinite. This creates an ever-present, pervasive anxiety. The function of being towards death is to wrench Dasein out of a state of inauthenticity and force it toward authenticity. Inauthentic existence, falling. Most people live in a state of falling into the anonymous collective known as the They, das Man. We avoid the terror of death by hiding in the distractions of daily life, gossip, and the endless pursuit of external validation. We treat death as a public event, something that happens to other people, or something that one does when the time comes. This denial allows us to remain unburdened, but it leads to a shallow, inauthentic existence where we live according to the norms of the they rather than the unique possibilities of the self. Authentic existence, resoluteness. Authentic existence begins the moment Dasein confronts the certainty of its own death. By constantly anticipating death, the individual is forced to realize the finiteness of their time and the irreversible nature of their choices. This confrontation induces a profound state of anxiety, angst. But this anxiety is productive. It cuts Dasein off from the distractions of the they and compels the individual to become resolute, to choose their projects, define their purpose, and fully live the possibilities of their own unique life before the ultimate possibility, death, forecloses all others. Being towards death is therefore the catalyst for genuine selfhood. It is the realization that only by living a life constantly shadowed by its end can we truly grasp the preciousness and unique responsibility of the time we have. Let's talk about the next philosophy idea, ironic process theory. The ironic process theory, or the white bear problem, is a concept in psychology and philosophy of mind that describes the paradoxical difficulty of suppressing unwanted thoughts and the tendency for those thoughts to return with greater force. It was proposed by social psychologist Daniel Wegner. The theory is rooted in the simple instruction, try not to think of a white bear. When given this command, people invariably find that the image of the white bear floods their consciousness. The very act of attempting to suppress the thought makes the thought more prominent. The ironic process theory posits that the mind uses two simultaneous systems when trying to suppress a thought, and the relationship between these two systems creates the ironic failure. The intentional operating process, the operator. This is the conscious, effortful process. It searches for mental content that matches the desired state, e.g., think about anything but the white bear. It requires cognitive resources and conscious energy. The ironic monitoring process, the monitor. This is the unconscious, automatic process. It continually scans the environment and the mind for evidence of the failure of suppression, e.g., checking, am I thinking of the white bear yet? It operates effortlessly and automatically, like a sentinel. The irony arises because the monitor must keep the forbidden thought active at the fringe of consciousness in order to efficiently detect its presence. The monitor, in its vigilance, is continually priming the very thought the operator is trying to suppress. The failure under cognitive load. The system works reasonably well when the mind is relaxed. However, the failure becomes inevitable under cognitive load, when the mind is distracted, stressed, tired, or hurried. When a person is stressed, the conscious operator process, which requires effort, breaks down. The unconscious monitor process, which is automatic and effortless, remains active. The monitor, having just primed the forbidden thought, now has no conscious check on it, and the thought floods into consciousness. This theory explains a wide range of common psychological phenomena. Insomnia. The person who tries desperately not to think about anything in order to fall asleep ensures that they think of the only thing they are monitoring, their own wakefulness. Anxiety. People who try to actively suppress the thought of a panic attack often make the possibility of the attack more salient, increasing their anxiety. Secret keeping. The effort to suppress a secret often causes slips of the tongue, as the monitor is continually verifying the secret's containment. The ironic process theory demonstrates that the human mind is profoundly incapable of pure mental negation. The act of saying no to a thought is often the very mechanism that grants that thought its power and permanence. The solution is often counterintuitive: to stop trying to suppress the thought and instead allow it to pass freely through consciousness, thus dismantling the monitor-operator failure loop.
Let's talk about the next philosophy idea: moral desert. Moral desert is a philosophical concept that refers to what an individual ethically deserves as a result of their past actions, character, or choices. It is the idea that there is a fundamental link between what a person has done and what that person ought to receive, whether that be reward, punishment, or treatment. Moral desert is a foundation for much of our ordinary moral language and social institutions, most notably in legal systems and theories of justice. The concept of just deserts. The concept of desert is defined by three core elements: the subject, the person who deserves something, example, the student; the object, the thing deserved, example, a high grade; the basis, the reason why it is deserved, example, studying hard and mastering the material. When we say a person has received their just deserts, we are asserting that the object they received perfectly matches the basis of their deserving. If a student receives a good grade based on merit, we say it is an act of justice rooted in desert. If a lazy student receives a good grade, the grade is a mere reward, but not an act of justice, because it violates the principle of desert. Moral desert and punishment. Moral desert is most visible in the philosophy of retributive justice. The retributivist argues that punishment is justified only because the offender morally deserves it, and the severity of the punishment should be proportional to the moral gravity of the crime. The purpose of punishment is not future deterrence or rehabilitation. Its purpose is to ensure the scales of moral desert are balanced. In this view, moral desert acts as a limiting principle. It prevents the state from punishing someone too severely, because the punishment would exceed what they deserve, and prevents the state from punishing an innocent person, because they deserve no punishment at all. The challenge of moral luck. The main philosophical challenge to moral luck is the problem of moral luck, primarily explored by philosophers Thomas Nagel and Bernard Williams. Moral luck refers to cases where external factors, luck, for which a person is not responsible, significantly influence the moral outcome of their actions. Imagine two identical drunken drivers.
Driver A gets home safely. Driver B, due to bad luck, hits a child who darted into the street. The internal choices, the decision to drink and drive, were identical. Yet, in most people's minds and in all legal systems, Driver B deserves far greater punishment and moral condemnation than Driver A. This discrepancy violates the principle of moral desert, because the difference in moral judgment is based on an external factor, the appearance of the child, and not the internal moral will of the agent. The existence of moral luck suggests that our moral universe is not as neat and tidy as the concept of desert requires. It forces us to decide whether our moral and legal systems should be based on the intentions of the moral agent, thus preserving desert, or the consequences of the agent's actions, thus acknowledging luck. Let's talk about the next philosophy idea: bicameral mind. The bicameral mind is a radical psychological and philosophical hypothesis put forth by Princeton psychologist Julian Jaynes in his 1976 book, The Origin of Consciousness in the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind. The theory proposes that human consciousness, as we understand it today, is a relatively recent cultural invention, emerging only about 3,000 years ago. Jaynes argued that prior to this time, humans did not possess a unified, introspective self-awareness. Instead, their minds operated in a state he called bicameral. The bicameral state. The word bicameral means having two chambers. Jaynes hypothesized that the minds of early humans were functionally divided into two separate parts. The authority, the God/voice, one hemisphere, often tied to the right hemisphere, generated verbal commands, warnings, and instructions. The listener, follower, the other hemisphere, often tied to the left speech-controlling hemisphere, passively received and obeyed these commands. Jaynes claimed that these commands were experienced by early humans not as their own thoughts, but as auditory hallucinations, the voices of gods, spirits, or ancestral figures. When an early human faced a new situation, they did not introspect or make a rational choice. They simply heard a divine voice in their head telling them what to do, and they obeyed. The complex decision-making we call will was outsourced to the inner voice of the gods. Evidence for the bicameral mind. Jaynes drew on several lines of evidence to support his controversial hypothesis. Ancient texts. Jaynes argued that texts like the Iliad show no evidence of modern psychological introspection, planning, or a unified self. Characters do not make choices. They are constantly told what to do by gods, literally deus ex machina. The gods' voices were in fact the final, externalized commands of their own right hemisphere. Schizophrenia. Jaynes suggested that the auditory hallucinations experienced by some schizophrenics are a neurological atavism, a temporary return to the old bicameral operating system. Schizophrenics hear external voices commanding them, a psychological mechanism that was once the norm for all humans. The breakdown into consciousness. Jaynes claimed the bicameral mind began to break down around the late 2nd millennium BCE due to increasing social complexity, urbanization, and the invention of writing. The old simple voice system could not cope with the demands of a complex urban society. As the voices became less reliable, the human mind was forced to internalize the decision-making process, leading to the painful, stressful, but necessary birth of subjective consciousness, the ability to introspect, rationalize, plan, and feel a unified self. The bicameral mind is a radical hypothesis because it suggests that consciousness is not a biological given, but a cultural historical development, forcing us to reconsider the entire history of human identity and mind. Let's talk about the next philosophy idea,
State of nature as war. Imagine a world stripped clean of all laws, governments, police, and contracts. There are no rules, no judges, and no authority to enforce order. This is the state of nature as envisioned by the English philosopher Thomas Hobbes in his 1651 masterpiece, Leviathan. Hobbes's profound and pessimistic assertion is that this natural state is a war of all against all, bellum omnium contra omnes. In this world, every individual is perfectly free and perfectly equal in their capacity to kill and subdue others. Even the physically weakest person can, through cunning, surprise, or alliance, kill the strongest. Because of this equality, every person is a constant threat to every other person. There is no such thing as justice or injustice, as these concepts only arise where there is law. Life in this state of nature is governed by three primary causes of quarrel: competition, diffidence, fear, and glory. Competition makes people invade for gain. Diffidence makes people invade for safety, and glory makes people invade for reputation. The consequence is perpetual, unceasing hostility. Crucially, Hobbes states that the war does not consist only in actual fighting, but in the known disposition to fight. Just as the nature of weather is not only rain, but also the anticipation of rain, the state of nature is a condition where people are constantly aware that they must be ready to defend themselves against sudden, violent invasion. Every person is an island, perpetually armed and on guard. The result of this constant fear is the complete collapse of civilization. There is no place for industry because the fruit of that labor is uncertain. There is no navigation, no culture of the earth, no art, no letters, and no society. The ultimate description of life in this state is Hobbes's most famous and chilling line. It is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. The state of nature as war is not just a description of a primitive past. It is a profound argument for the necessity of a strong government, the Leviathan. Hobbes concludes that the only way to escape this terrifying state of nature is for every individual to rationally surrender their absolute freedom to a single, sovereign power whose authority is absolute. The exchange is simple. We trade our limitless freedom for the guarantee of security and order. Because the worst tyranny of government is infinitely preferable to the unconstrained terror of the natural state. The fear of death drives us into the chains of civil society.
Let's talk about the next philosophy idea, panopticism. Panopticism is a term coined and extensively analyzed by the French philosopher Michel Foucault, primarily in his work Discipline and Punish. It is not just an architectural design. It is a profound concept that describes a specific, modern mechanism of power and social control that operates through the perpetual threat of visibility. The idea originates with the 18th century English philosopher Jeremy Bentham, who designed the panopticon, a proposed architectural blueprint for a perfect prison. The design is a circular structure with individual cells around the circumference and a central, single tower in the middle. The unique feature is that the prisoners in the cells can never see the central tower, but the single inspector in the tower can see into every cell. The prisoner never knows if they are being watched or not. The genius of the panopticon is that the power operates not by constant surveillance, but by the unverifiable certainty of surveillance. The prisoner internalizes the gaze. Because they do not know when the guard is watching, they must behave as if the guard is watching all the time. The power becomes automatic and disindividualized. The guard barely needs to be present. the mere architecture of the gaze forces the individual to police and discipline themselves. Foucault argued that panopticism escaped the prison walls and became the dominant mechanism of power in modern society. He saw its principles applied everywhere, in schools, hospitals, factories, and bureaucracy. Modern society is a disciplinary society that uses constant normalization and surveillance to produce obedient, useful individuals. The fundamental shift in power is crucial. Power is no longer a public spectacle of force, like a public execution, but an invisible, omnipresent, and silent mechanism. The central tower becomes a metaphor for any system of control where the individual is known, but cannot know in return. The omnipresent cameras, the digital monitoring of browsing history, the constant metric tracking in a corporation. The effect of panopticism is the creation of a docile body, a body that has internalized the constraints of the system. The subject becomes their own warden, constantly monitoring, judging, and normalizing their own behavior against an invisible, external standard. Power is exercised not just on the body, but through the mind. Foucault's concept is a chilling statement that modern freedom is merely the self-policing of a perpetually observed, disciplined subject.
Let's talk about the next philosophy idea, fallenness of Dasein. The fallenness of Dasein, Verfalleinheit, is a central, unavoidable concept in the philosophy of Martin Heidegger, particularly in Being and Time. It is not a moral or theological term implying sin or a fall from grace. Rather, it is a description of the inevitable, existential way human being, or Dasein, exists most of the time. It is the tendency of Dasein to lose itself in the world and in the crowd, thereby obscuring its own authentic self. Heidegger argues that Dasein, by its very nature, is being in the world. We are not simply subjects observing objects, we are always already immersed and tangled up in the material world, in our tools, our projects, and our social environment. Fallenness is the specific, negative way this immersion usually manifests. Fallenness is a movement towards the anonymous public self, which Heidegger calls the they, das Man. When Dasein is fallen, it does not live its own life, but lives the life prescribed by the public, by common sense, and by the social expectations of the moment. We speak the language of the they, we are interested in what one is interested in, and we feel what one feels. The fallen self is the self of the average, the inoffensive, and the socially acceptable. The key features of fallenness are threefold. First, idle talk, Gerede. This is not just gossip, but any form of superficial, second-hand conversation that aims not to communicate genuine understanding, but simply to keep the communication flowing. Idle talk is cut off from the original experience of being, serving only to lull Dasein into a false sense of security and knowledge. Second, curiosity, Neugier. This is not genuine intellectual inquiry, but a restless, distracted pursuit of novelty for its own sake. It is the constant urge to move to the next thing, the next distraction, the next piece of news, which prevents Dasein from settling down and confronting the deeper, authentic questions of its own existence. Third, ambiguity, Zweideutigkeit. In the fallen state, nothing is clear. Everything seems understood, but nothing is truly grasped. The public self maintains a pleasant, comfortable ambiguity that allows us to believe we know what is going on, while ensuring we never have to commit to a genuine, unique point of view. The fallenness of Dasein is a powerful critique of inauthentic living,
It is the state in which Dasein flees from its own unique, terrifying freedom, being towards death, and takes refuge in the comfortable, anonymous prison of the public self. Authenticity, for Heidegger, is the painful, difficult act of wrenching oneself out of the comforting grip of the they and reclaiming the responsibility for one's own chosen life.
Let's talk about the next philosophy idea, the undead God. The concept of the undead God is a metaphorical idea rooted in the philosophy of Friedrich Nietzsche, specifically an extension of his famous declaration, "God is dead." It is a critique of the phenomenon where modern, secular society continues to cling to the moral and cultural remnants of Christianity even after rejecting its theological and metaphysical foundation. Nietzsche's fear was not that people would wake up and immediately become nihilists. His fear was that they would refuse to acknowledge the full, catastrophic implications of God's death. The undead God is the resulting phantom that haunts the modern consciousness. The undead God is the persistent belief in absolute, objective moral values, like universal human rights, the intrinsic value of compassion, or the moral imperative of equality, after the belief in the divine source that originally guaranteed those values has evaporated. The diagnosis is this: Western man has discarded the theological dogma, the resurrection, the divine creator, the literal heaven and hell, but has preserved the Christian moral code. We are like people who have demolished the entire foundation of a building, but insist on keeping the roof suspended in the air. The undead God represents a profound state of intellectual dishonesty and cultural weakness. We are too cowardly to create our own values, the task of the Übermensch, so we keep the old values and desperately try to anchor them in new, flimsy sources. We replace God with reason, claiming that morality is simply logical. We replace God with nature, claiming that morality is biologically determined. We replace God with society, claiming that morality is a necessary social contract. To Nietzsche, all these attempts are intellectually bankrupt. They are merely secular disguises for the Christian morality of pity and humility, a morality he believed was ultimately life-denying. The undead God is the ethical imperative that says, be kind, be equal, be humble, but cannot answer the crucial question of why, without ultimately pointing back to the grave of the very God it claims to have abandoned. The problem with the undead God is that it fosters an inauthentic life. It allows people to feel morally superior without taking on the terrifying responsibility of justifying their values in a meaningless universe. Nietzsche saw this as a temporary, unstable condition. The logical contradictions of upholding Christian morality without a Christian God would eventually lead to a catastrophic cultural breakdown, a final, total confrontation with nihilism that he called the time of the great midday. The undead God, in its half-life, prevents the emergence of a truly free, life-affirming human being. Let's talk about the next philosophy idea, vanity of existence. The vanity of existence is a philosophical concept that captures the ultimate futility and emptiness of human pursuits, ambition, and all worldly achievements. It is a central theme in existential pessimism and is most famously articulated in the biblical book of Ecclesiastes, where the author, Koheleth, opens with the famous line, "Vanity of vanities, all is vanity." The term vanity here does not simply mean egotism or pride. The Hebrew word hevel, often translated as vanity, literally means breath, vapor, or mere fleeting mist. It denotes something that is insubstantial, ephemeral, and ultimately meaningless, a vapor that disperses the moment you try to grasp it. The philosophy of the vanity of existence is an experiential conclusion drawn from the honest observation of life. Koheleth, having pursued every possible avenue of human endeavor, wisdom, pleasure, wealth, labor, and power, concludes that all of them lead to the same dead end. First, the vanity of labor and achievement. The immense effort we put into our careers, our possessions, and our grand projects is ultimately undone by time and death. You labor all your life to build an empire, only to have it inherited by a fool who tears it down, or to have it forgotten by the next generation. The fruit of your toil is not permanent, it is merely vapor. Second, the vanity of wisdom and pleasure. Even the deepest wisdom and the most intense pleasure are subject to the same cosmic indifference. The wise man and the fool both die, and once they are gone, their differences are erased by oblivion. The pursuit of pleasure is merely chasing the wind. The satisfaction is momentary, and the striving begins again immediately, yielding no lasting contentment. The most profound source of the vanity is the monotonicity of time. All things happen to all people. The righteous and the wicked, the wise and the foolish, all share the same fate, death. There is nothing new under the sun. All events, all joys, and all sorrows have been endlessly repeated throughout history. This cyclical, unchanging nature of existence renders all individual effort meaningless in the grand scheme. The conclusion of the vanity of existence is a radical form of resignation. Since nothing we do can ultimately conquer time, death, or oblivion, the striving is fundamentally futile. The only path to a kind of peace is a subtle, melancholic acceptance of the present moment. The author suggests that since all is mist, the only good remaining is to eat, drink, and find enjoyment in the simple, ephemeral pleasures of the day, acknowledging them as temporary gifts from God, rather than as lasting conquests over time. The philosophy does not lead to action, but to a quiet, sorrowful recognition of life's fundamental insubstantiality.
Let's talk about the next philosophy idea, apophatic theology. Apophatic theology, also known as the via negativa, the negative way, is a distinctive tradition of mystical and philosophical thought that asserts that God is fundamentally unknowable by human reason and language. It is a system that defines the nature of the divine not by what God is, but by what God is not. The core premise is that God is so utterly transcendent, so far beyond the categories of finite human experience, that any positive, declarative statement about God inevitably limits and misrepresents the divine being. To say God is good or God is powerful is to use human terms of goodness and power, which are inadequate to describe an infinite, uncreated reality. The apophatic tradition, therefore, begins a disciplined process of theological negation. The theologian systematically strips away all inadequate attributes. We cannot say God is temporal, so God is eternal. We cannot say God is finite, so God is infinite. We cannot say God is created, so God is uncreated. This process is not an attempt to deny God's existence, but an act of profound intellectual humility. It is a recognition that the only way to speak truthfully about God is to confess the absolute failure of human language to capture the divine essence.
The purpose of the via negativa is to lead the mind away from concrete, false idols of human conception toward a pure, unconditioned apprehension of the divine mystery. The highest affirmation in apophatic theology is not a positive statement, but the recognition that the ultimate truth about God lies in the profound silence and darkness. The mind reaches a point of aporia, perplexity, or impasse, where all language fails. It is in this intellectual and linguistic vacuum that the believer is thought to experience a direct, non-conceptual communion with the divine. The emptying of the mind of all false images of God is the precursor to a mystical union with the true, unknowable reality. Apophatic theology is often contrasted with cataphatic theology, the via positiva, which uses positive statements and affirmations about God. God is love. God is Father. The two ways are often seen not as contradictory, but as complementary paths. The positive way draws the believer into relationship through analogy and metaphor, while the negative way leads the believer beyond all analogy into the ultimate mystery. The tension between the two paths reflects the fundamental problem of faith, the human necessity to speak about an entity that is inherently unspeakable.
Let's talk about the next philosophy idea, the last man. The last man, der letzte Mensch, is a crucial, pessimistic figure introduced by the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche in his work Thus Spoke Zarathustra. The last man is not the last human being to physically survive, but the last spiritual human being, the result of a historical process of decline that follows the death of God. Nietzsche presents the last man as the most contemptible creature on earth, the ultimate symptom of societal decay, and the complete opposite of the ideal Übermensch, overman. The last man is the product of a comfortable, stable, and completely secularized society that values nothing more than mediocrity, security, and superficial contentment. He has seen the death of God and the collapse of objective values, but instead of confronting the terrifying freedom of the void, he flees back into a life of small, managed pleasures. The defining characteristics of the last man are: 1. The pursuit of comfort. The last man's greatest desire is to avoid all discomfort, pain, and great striving. His goal is a life of maximum pleasure and minimum risk. He is content with a good job, a pleasant routine, and the latest distractions. He is the ultimate consumer. 2. The fear of greatness. The last man despises anyone who strives for heroic, unique, or dangerous goals. He views ambition, profound thought, and passionate commitment as forms of sickness or extremism. His primary social function is to enforce conformity, to normalize everything, and to pull all great spirits down to his own level of petty, harmless contentment. He says, "We have invented happiness," and he means the happiness of not having to think or choose profoundly. 3. The loss of self. The last man has no self, no singular passion, and no unique purpose. His identity is entirely interchangeable with that of his neighbor. He has no intense loves, no intense hatreds, and no grand visions. He is a herd animal, content to graze peacefully within the secure boundaries of the comfortable social order. Nietzsche introduced the last man as a horrifying prophecy, a warning to humanity about the kind of society they were on the path to creating. The death of God was supposed to liberate us, but the last man shows that humanity, rather than embracing the dangerous freedom of creation, might simply choose the comfortable enslavement of triviality. The challenge of the last man is ethical. It forces us to ask whether our pursuit of social and technological comfort is ultimately a profound spiritual defeat. It demands that we distinguish between a life that is easy and a life that is valuable. And it warns that if we do not choose to create something magnificent and difficult, the path of least resistance will lead to a shallow, ignoble end. The last man is the man who chooses the couch over the mountain.
Let's talk about the next philosophy idea, master-slave dialectic. The master-slave dialectic is a core concept developed by the German philosopher G.W.F. Hegel in his 1807 work, The Phenomenology of Spirit. It is a thought experiment that dramatically illustrates how self-consciousness and true freedom emerge not through isolation, but through a terrifying life and death struggle for recognition between two independent beings. The dialectic begins with the premise that two self-consciousnesses meet for the first time. Each one desires to be recognized as a free, independent self. But to gain this recognition, each must force the other to submit. This mutual desire leads to a fundamental, inevitable struggle for recognition, which is a fight to the death. The struggle, however, does not end in death. At the moment of potential killing, one consciousness submits out of the primal fear of death. The other consciousness prevails because they overcame the fear of death. This is the moment the two roles are established, the master and the slave. The master is the one who risked death and now has his independence recognized by the slave. The slave is the one who preferred life over freedom and now submits to the master. The paradox now begins to unfold. The master's problem. The master has achieved his goal of recognition, but the recognition he receives is hollow. He is only recognized by the slave, a being he himself does not recognize as a fully independent, free consciousness. The master's consciousness is reflected only in an unfree, subservient mirror. The master, therefore, remains trapped in his own independence, unable to achieve genuine, satisfying recognition. The slave's liberation. The slave who submits is forced to work. The slave is compelled to labor upon the natural world, to shape raw materials into objects that satisfy the master's desires. In the act of transforming nature through work, tilling the field, forging the metal, the slave begins to see his own independent spirit reflected in the object he created. The field he tilled is no longer just nature, it is his labor embodied. Through this disciplined, formative work, the slave achieves self-recognition. He comes to realize his own essential independence and freedom, not from the master's gaze, but through his own interaction with the world. The dialectic concludes with a profound reversal. The master, reliant on the slave's labor for his existence, becomes spiritually dependent and trapped. The slave, through disciplined creative work, overcomes his fear of death and achieves the true, genuine form of independence. Freedom and true self-consciousness, therefore, are achieved not by domination, but by formative labor and the overcoming of the fear of death. Let's talk about the next philosophy idea, the Gnostic demiurge.
The Gnostic demiurge is a foundational concept within Gnosticism, an ancient religious and philosophical movement that viewed the material world and its creation in a dramatically pessimistic light, standing in stark contrast to Orthodox Judaism and Christianity. In Gnostic cosmology, the ultimate reality is the true God, a perfect, transcendent, utterly unknowable spirit of light, goodness, and pure being that dwells in a realm called the pleroma, fullness. This true God is too perfect to have any direct contact with the flawed material world. The problem, then, is the origin of our imperfect, suffering material world. The Gnostics solve this by introducing the figure of the demiurge, a Greek word meaning public worker or craftsman. The demiurge is a lesser, flawed, and often malevolent deity who mistakenly believes himself to be the supreme God. He is born from a catastrophic error or failure in the lower levels of the divine pleroma. Due to his own ignorance and arrogance, he attempts to create a perfect reality. But because he is imperfect and alienated from the true God's pure light, he can only create the corrupt, suffering physical world we inhabit. The demiurge is famously identified with the traditional Old Testament God, Yahweh, by many Gnostic sects. The Gnostics read the biblical creation story and concluded that a truly perfect God would not create a world marked by death, decay, and the necessity of suffering. The creator God of this world is therefore tyrannical, jealous, judgmental, and profoundly ignorant of the true transcendent light. The human condition, according to Gnosticism, is one of tragic entrapment. The human body and the material world were created by the demiurge, but within every Gnostic human is a divine spark, a piece of the light of the true God, trapped in the physical prison of the body. The purpose of Gnostic practice is to achieve gnosis, secret knowledge, which is the revelation that the creator of this world is not the true God, but the foolish demiurge. This knowledge allows the trapped divine spark to be awakened and to finally escape the demiurge's material prison at death, ascending back to the true realm of the pleroma. The Gnostic demiurge is a powerful philosophical idea because it offers a radical solution to the problem of evil. The problem is not a mystery of God's will. The problem is the Creator himself. It is a profoundly pessimistic cosmology that dismisses the entire material world as a mistake and a prison created by a tyrannical error.
Let's talk about the next philosophy idea: transvaluation of values. The transvaluation of values, Umwertung aller Werte, is the ultimate project proposed by the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, a necessary step humanity must take in the wake of his declaration that God is dead. It is a call for a radical, fundamental reassessment and reversal of all traditional moral and cultural values. Nietzsche argued that Western civilization's dominant morality, Christian morality, was not born out of strength and affirmation of life, but out of weakness, resentment, and fear. He traced its origin back to a psychological phenomenon he called ressentiment. The genealogy of morality. Nietzsche's historical analysis, or genealogy, identified two fundamentally opposed types of morality. Master morality, the noble. This is the original, healthy morality of the strong, noble, and life-affirming. It is created by the ruling class, who define good as that which is beneficial to them: strength, pride, courage, and power. They define bad simply as the contemptible traits of the layer class: weakness, timidity, and utility.
This morality is active and self-glorifying. Slave morality, the priestly/weak. This is the reactive morality created by the downtrodden, the oppressed, and the suffering, the slaves. Unable to act against their oppressors, they engage in a psychological revenge, ressentiment. They invert master morality, calling the master's traits evil. Pride is evil, power is evil, and elevating their own necessary traits to good. Humility is good, pity is good, obedience is good. This morality is passive and life-denying. Nietzsche argued that slave morality, through Christianity, eventually conquered the West. The civilization we inherited is built on this morality of weakness, self-denial, and guilt. The transvaluation. The transvaluation of values is the call to reverse this 2,000-year-old inversion. Since God is dead and the values of humility and self-denial have no objective anchor, the strong individual must undertake the following project. Destroy the old tablets. Cast down the morality of ressentiment. Reaffirm life. Re-establish values based on the full, passionate affirmation of life on earth, including its pain, its struggle, and its struggle for power. Create new values. The individual, the Übermensch, must become a new moral sovereign, defining what is good as that which promotes growth, self-overcoming, and the creative expression of power. The transvaluation of values is therefore the ultimate act of philosophical freedom. It is the radical, conscious choice to step out of the moral prison of historical accident and create a personal, life-affirming ethical system that is worthy of the human spirit.
Let's talk about the next philosophy idea, will to power. The will to power, Wille zur Macht, is the fundamental, driving metaphysical principle at the heart of Friedrich Nietzsche's mature philosophy. It is not merely a political or social drive for domination, but an essential, unconscious force that explains all human, biological, and even cosmic phenomena. Nietzsche posited the will to power as a substitute for the Christian concept of God and a replacement for Schopenhauer's pessimistic will to live. He asserted that the universe is not driven by a blind impulse to merely survive, will to live, but by an aggressive, ceaseless impulse to overcome, grow, and exert force, to increase one's power and potential. The will to power in life. In human and biological life, the will to power manifests in two core ways. Self-overcoming. The most refined expression of the will to power is directed inward. It is the drive to overcome one's own limitations, master one's weaknesses, discipline one's body, and transcend one's current self. Every act of striving, creation, self-improvement, or intense learning is a manifestation of the will to power seeking to increase the richness and complexity of life. Creation of value. The will to power is the psychological engine behind the transvaluation of values. When a person creates a new moral code, a work of art, or a new philosophical system, they are not seeking truth. They are expressing their will to power by imposing their own interpretation and value system upon the chaos of the world. The critique of other drives. Nietzsche argued that seemingly selfless drives are often disguised expressions of the will to power. The will to truth is merely the will to power disguised as an intellectual drive, the desire to impose one's own structure, truth, onto the world.
The will to pity, compassion, is a dangerous, life-denying form of the will to power. By helping the weak, one subconsciously makes oneself feel superior and prevents the development of the weak person's own strength. Pity, for Nietzsche, is the will to power masquerading as humility. The consequences of frustration. When the will to power is frustrated, repressed, or thwarted, it leads to destructive psychological states. Resentment. The vengeful impulse of the weak to deny the values of the strong and create a morality of denial, slave morality. Nihilism. The will to power, unable to find an external goal, turns inward, seeking its own end in the final, self-destructive desire for nothingness. Ultimately, the will to power is Nietzsche's affirmation of the chaotic, amoral, and struggle-filled nature of existence. It is a philosophy that mandates continuous striving, self-creation, and risk. Life is defined by its ceaseless struggle to exert force, and the highest expression of a human being is to become a relentless artist of one's own self.
Let's talk about the next philosophy idea, divine hiddenness. Divine hiddenness is a key problem in the philosophy of religion, specifically within theistic systems that claim God is all-loving, desires a relationship with humanity, and is accessible to all. The problem asks, why is God not more obvious? The core observation is that if a benevolent God exists and desires all people to enter into a loving relationship, then that God would surely provide clear, easily accessible evidence of his existence and intentions to every sincere seeker. Yet the evidence for God is ambiguous, non-coercive, and often deeply disputed. The problem of non-resistant non-belief. The argument for divine hiddenness focuses on the existence of non-resistant non-believers, people who are genuinely open to believing in God, who are seeking truth sincerely, and who are not morally or emotionally resisting the idea of a relationship with the divine, but who simply find the evidence unconvincing. The argument can be summarized. A perfectly loving God would desire to enter into a saving, personal relationship with every human being. A perfectly loving God would ensure that the evidence for his existence is sufficient for any sincere seeker to obtain belief without overcoming unreasonable obstacles. There exists a large number of sincere, non-resistant non-believers who are unable to achieve a confident belief in God despite genuine effort. Therefore, a perfectly loving God does not exist, or at least does not exist in the form traditionally described. The issue is one of inscrutability. If God truly loves, why the game of hide and seek? Why leave the foundation of eternal life and ultimate truth contingent on ambiguous historical texts, subjective spiritual experiences, and philosophical arguments that are perpetually inconclusive? Theological responses to hiddenness. Theistic philosophers offer several defenses for why a loving God would remain hidden. The value of free choice. If the evidence for God were overwhelming, example, God speaking directly from the clouds, belief would cease to be a free choice and would become an unavoidable rational conclusion, like believing that 2 + 2 = 4. God's hiddenness preserves human autonomy and the existential freedom to choose faith. The soul-making argument. Hiddenness is necessary for the development of deep, mature faith. A relationship sought and maintained despite ambiguity and silence is ultimately more meaningful, resilient, and profound than a relationship based on overwhelming, continuous evidence. God is silent to make us seek Him more actively, thus strengthening our moral and spiritual character. The epistemological gap. God's nature is so far beyond human comprehension that our current faculties are simply incapable of fully recognizing the evidence provided. The problem is not God's unwillingness to speak, but humanity's inability to fully hear.
Divine hiddenness is a powerful challenge because it shifts the focus from the suffering of the body, the problem of evil, to the suffering of the mind and soul, the anxiety, doubt, and intellectual frustration of the sincere but unsuccessful seeker.
Let's talk about the next philosophy idea: inherent meaninglessness. The concept of inherent meaninglessness is the philosophical conclusion that life, the universe, and all human endeavors do not possess any objective, pre-established, or intrinsic purpose or value. This is the central tenet of existential nihilism. The conclusion is arrived at by observing the vast, cold indifference of the cosmos and the arbitrary nature of human history and morality. The argument for inherent meaninglessness rests on two primary observations. First, the cosmic scale. The human being is a tiny, temporary biological accident on a small planet orbiting one of billions of stars in one of billions of galaxies. Our entire civilization's existence is a mere fraction of a second on the cosmic timeline. Given this scale, the suffering, joy, and meaning we create are functionally irrelevant to the universe itself. The universe does not offer any moral compass, any final reward, or any ultimate goal for our existence. It is silent and indifferent. Second, the lack of ultimate justification. Any meaning we assign to our lives, family, career, art, religion, is ultimately a choice, a convention, or a comfort. If you ask, "Why do I live for my career?" the answer might be, "To provide for my family." If you ask, "Why provide for your family?" the answer might be, "Because family gives my life purpose." But if you ask the final, existential question, "Why does purpose matter at all?" there is no objective, non-circular answer. The entire chain of meaning rests on an unproven, self-chosen assumption. The meaning is not inherent, it is constructed. The philosophical shock of inherent meaninglessness is the realization that truth and value are separate. Science can tell us all the facts of the universe, the laws of motion, the age of the stars, but it can never tell us what to value or why we should exist. The objective facts are meaningless. Value is entirely a human creation. The philosophical task after confronting this meaninglessness is not despair, but creation. The inherent meaninglessness of the universe is the necessary precondition for radical freedom. Because nothing is true, everything is permitted. Because no purpose is given, all purposes must be chosen. Existentialists like Jean-Paul Sartre and Albert Camus argue that once we accept the meaninglessness, we become responsible for defining our own essence. The challenge is to live with a fierce, passionate commitment to the subjective values we have chosen, knowing full well that they are ultimately temporary and arbitrary. The meaning of life is not a discovery. It is a relentless, courageous act of creation.
Let's talk about the next philosophy idea: ego death. Ego death is a concept originating in mystical, spiritual, and psycholytic traditions, but has gained significant philosophical relevance as an exploration of the boundaries of self and consciousness. It describes a profound, temporary psychological state characterized by the complete loss of subjective self-identity. It is the sensation of the collapse of the separate, constructed personality, the ego, and the experience of a temporary merger with an external, universal, or undifferentiated consciousness. The structure of the ego. In psychological terms, the ego is the organized part of the personality structure that includes defense mechanisms, judgment, tolerance, and conscious awareness. It is the narrative voice that says, "I am this person," which is built from memories, roles, social status, and personal history. The ego is what separates me from not me.
Ego death is the psychological dismantling of this protective structure. It is typically triggered by intense meditation, spiritual crisis, or powerful psychedelic compounds. The experience of death and rebirth. The experience is often described in paradoxically negative terms, leading to the name death. Dissolution of boundaries. The person loses the sense of where their body ends and the world begins. The distinction between subject and object collapses. Loss of personal history. All sense of personal identity, name, job, relationships, and memories vanishes. The self is experienced as a raw, fundamental awareness without content. Overwhelming unity. This is often followed by a sense of oceanic merger with the universe, God, or the collective consciousness. The individual feels as though they have returned to an original, undifferentiated state of being. The psychological utility of ego death lies in the concept of rebirth. By temporarily destroying the rigid, fixed structure of the ego, the mind is freed from its defensive and limiting patterns. The experience often results in profound, lasting changes in perspective, including a reduction of the fear of death. Having experienced the death of the ego, the person often feels less fear of physical death, as the ultimate boundary has been conceptually overcome. A release from attachment. The triviality of the ego's concerns, social status, petty quarrels, is revealed, leading to a greater focus on authentic values like compassion and connection. Philosophically, ego death challenges the bundle theory of self and the substance theory of self alike. If the self is merely a collection of perceptions, the bundle theory, then the self should simply vanish. If there is a persistent soul, the substance theory, then the substance should remain unchanged. The experience of ego death suggests that the self is neither an eternal soul nor a random bundle, but a contingent narrative construct that can be temporarily collapsed, revealing a deeper, more fundamental layer of consciousness that connects all things. The death of the I is the discovery of the we.
Let's talk about the next philosophy idea, no-self doctrine. The no-self doctrine, or anatta, anatman, is a foundational philosophical pillar of Buddhism. It stands in direct contrast to the Hindu and Western metaphysical belief in an eternal, unchanging soul or permanent self, Atman. The doctrine asserts that there is no such entity as a fixed, independent, enduring personal identity. The self is a profound and dangerous illusion. The Buddhist analysis begins by challenging the common intuition that there is a permanent I that persists through all changes in life. The doctrine argues that if a permanent self existed, it would have to be permanent and unchanging. It must remain the same from birth to death. Autonomous. It must be independent of all other factors. Controllable. It must be something that can be mastered or controlled. The Buddhist analysis of reality concludes that no entity meets these criteria. Instead, the person is merely a combination of 5 aggregates, skandhas, all of which are impermanent and constantly changing. Form, rupa, the physical body. Sensation, vedana, feelings like pleasure and pain. Perception, samjna, the ability to recognize objects. Mental formations, samskara, volitional impulses, intentions, and habits. Consciousness, vijnana, the awareness of the other 4 aggregates. The doctrine asserts that the belief in a permanent, unified self is simply the mind mistaking the temporary, rapidly changing aggregate of these 5 components for a fixed, substantial entity.
The self is better viewed as a river or a flame. The name remains, but the material components are constantly flowing and changing. The philosophical and ethical utility of the no-self doctrine lies in its direct connection to suffering, dukkha. The fundamental cause of suffering is clinging or attachment. The object of all clinging is the illusion of a permanent self, the I, and the things the self owns, mine. We suffer when we cling to the illusion of our fixed self and try to control the aggregates which are inherently uncontrollable and subject to change, decay, and death. By fully realizing the no-self doctrine, the understanding that the self is anatta, not self, the clinging ceases. If there is no permanent I to be born, to suffer, and to die, then the root of fear and attachment is severed. This realization is the gateway to nirvana, the cessation of the cycle of suffering. The no-self doctrine is thus not a nihilistic denial of reality, but a precise, liberating analysis that frees the individual from the self-imposed burden of maintaining a fictional permanent identity.
Let's talk about the next philosophy idea: solipsism. Solipsism is an extreme philosophical position that holds that one's own mind is the only thing that is certain to exist. The word comes from the Latin solus, alone, and ipse, self. The solipsist is convinced that they are the only true conscious mind, and that the external world and all other people are merely contents of their own consciousness. Solipsism is not typically adopted as a serious working philosophy, but it is a frequent intellectual byproduct of confronting the problem of other minds and the fundamental nature of perception. It is the ultimate expression of epistemological uncertainty. The argument for solipsism is rooted in the infallibility of subjective experience. You have immediate, direct, and undeniable access to your own thoughts, feelings, and sensations. The fact that you are consciously experiencing a thought right now is the only fact you can be absolutely sure of. The external world, the chair you sit on, the device you read this on, the person next to you, is only known to you through the electrical signals interpreted by your brain. Since your brain can be tricked, as in the brain in a vat thought experiment, the external world cannot be proven to exist independently of your perception. The solipsist pushes this to the extreme. If the world and all its contents are merely experiences in my mind, then it is logically possible that the world, including all other people, has no independent existence and is simply a complex construction of my own consciousness. Other people are merely sophisticated philosophical zombies, entities that look and act like conscious beings but have no inner subjective life. The consequence of embracing solipsism is absolute intellectual isolation. The solipsist cannot trust the testimony of others, cannot share genuine moral responsibility, and cannot feel true empathy, because all other entities are merely characters in the solipsist's private dream. However, the practical life of a solipsist quickly exposes the limitations of the theory. No one lives as a true solipsist. Even the most rigorous skeptic avoids stepping in front of cars and mourns the loss of loved ones. This highlights the deep, practical impossibility of solipsism. While it may be logically coherent, it is psychologically unlivable. The true value of solipsism is as a methodological challenge. It forces the philosopher to trace the limits of knowledge and to clearly define what evidence is required to move from the certainty of one's own mind to the justifiable belief in an external world shared by other conscious minds. It is the final, lonely outpost of intellectual doubt.